Today we will answer one question. Was Jesus a myth created at the Council of Nicaea, or perhaps by later Christians? For reference, the Council of Nicaea was in 328 AD, the early 4th century. Major disclaimer ahead, this presentation is not an attempt to proselytize, convert, or convince people of Christianity. However, this is an attempt to show the archaeological evidence that supports the Christians' answers to this question. Another disclaimer, I am an Orthodox Christian, which some may take and say that I am biased in my assumptions, so feel free to do your own research on the supposed context of these findings. Now back to the topic of hand, was Jesus a mythological figure invented by the Council of Nicaea? I'm just kidding, not really though. Our first piece of evidence is the St. James ossuary. The St. James ossuary is a limestone box containing the inscription James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. At least that's what it says when transliterated into English. Why is this significant? Ossuaries, for those who may not know, are a stone box used to contain the bones during burial. Back then, it was a luxury meant only for the elite class, or perhaps someone considered elite not by wealth but by religious significance. The ossuary was found in the Silwan area of the Kidron Valley, and its existence was pronounced on October 21st, 2002. Now, onto the significance of the inscription of the box. Now, I'll paraphrase heavily here, but Professor Kamil Fuchs of Tel Aviv University has said that apart from the ossuary, thousands have been seen with inscriptions, yet only one other has been found with the inscription mentioning a brother of any kind, which insinuates that it was not common practice and was only done if there was a meaningful reason to mention him. Furthermore, Professor Fuchs procured a statistical analysis of these three names, Jesus, James, and Joseph, in Jerusalem in the 1st century, and found that less than 2 people could have been named James with a father named Joseph and a brother named Jesus in Jerusalem around the time the box would have been produced. Now, this is where we get a problem. In June 2003, the Israeli Antiquities Authority published a report claiming the inscription was a modern forgery. However, in 2006, world-renowned expert in stone patinas, Wolfgang Elizabeth Krumbein, analyzed the artifact and concluded that the inscription is ancient, concluding that if this were a forgery, it would require the development of ultra-advanced techniques, in-depth knowledge, and extensive collaboration from a large number of experts in various fields, essentially being the best forgery ever made. Now, quick recap, this box belongs to James, the supposed brother of Jesus. Studies and experts claim that this is an ancient inscription and not a forgery. The dating of the box to the context of Jewish burials matches with the timeline of Christians of Jesus' existence. And lastly, it most likely couldn't have belonged to another James who so happened to have a brother named Jesus. Now, onto our second evidence, the Alexamenos graffito. Now, this is not only more evidence for the existence of a Christ-like figure, but is also the earliest depiction we have of Jesus. And I'll also admit this doesn't necessarily prove the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, but it does prove that the early Christians worship someone who died on a cross. And like I said, it's a very crude drawing. This graffiti shows a man facing another man with the head of a donkey on a cross, with the inscription beneath it, Alexamenos worships his God. Wait, did early Christians worship a donkey-headed god? No, they most likely didn't. Taking into account the cultural relationship between the Roman pagans and Christianity, the Christians were a minority oppressed group that were scorned and often killed for their beliefs. Drawing their god with the face of a donkey could be interpreted as a severe insult. In other words, calling their god an ass face. We can't conclusively date when the inscription is made, but we can say that it was most likely between the first date and the early 3rd century, about 70 AD to 210, 220, around that time. And again, once again, says Alexamenos worships his god. Just to recap, an ancient graffiti showing a man with a donkey head on a cross being worshipped by the so-called Alexamenos shows that the early Christians did worship a man who supposedly died via crucifixion. This gives more evidence that a Christ-like figure existed before the Nicene Council, and that the idea of Jesus wasn't made up in the 4th century. In conclusion, these two archaeological finds are some of many that pertain to Christianity. They aren't one-off instances. I highly recommend doing your own research into these findings. Thank you for watching.